In today's video, I'm going to try and convince you why a manga with less than 20 chapters is worth your time to read, and also why I think this title has a really great chance at becoming a much bigger series. The manga in question is called Centuria. It's a dark fantasy title with some really impressive art, including monster designs that look like this. It also has a pretty interesting connection to some other big manga and anime that you've probably heard of if you're a fan of this channel. More on that later. Now, why am I recommending this title so early? Manga get canceled like all of the time, so reading a title in its first few years can be a bit of a risk when you don't know whether the manga will actually build a big enough readership to survive the chopping block. Well, my gut is telling me Centuria has what it takes to go the distance. And a big reason for that feeling has to do with its genre. You see, Centuria, at least so far, is a traditional fantasy story. And I don't know if you've noticed, but fantasy is having a bit of a moment. The 1-2 punch of Frieren Beyond Journey's End and Dungeon Meshi have kicked off an unexpected fantasy renaissance, and I, for one, am having a great time with both titles. These anime have reminded me how satisfying stories about magic, myths, and monsters can be when created with care and attention. If you follow anime and manga closely, then I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. These titles, especially Frieren, have become wildly popular this year, and their anime adaptations have led to a spike in manga and merchandise sales for both series. And I get why. There's a lot to love. Great characters, amazing production values, and what I'm interested in talking about for this video, fantasy world building. When done right, fantasy and world building go hand in hand, because fantasy is both a genre and a setting. Both of these titles stick out to me specifically because of how much attention they dedicate to crafting interesting and believable fantasy settings. They're worlds I've come to believe in, with rules I understand and accept as fact. It sounds simple, but this is one of the hardest things for any anime or manga to get right, and also one of the easiest to ignore. I've talked about setting a good amount in past videos, precisely because I think it's an aspect of storytelling that is lacking in a lot of the manga and anime I end up failing to connect with. This is doubly true for fantasy stories, and for a specific reason. For around the last decade or so, a lot of mainstream Japanese fantasy anime have been hijacked by an incredibly popular subgenre. If you've been in this community for a while, chances are you know which one, but if not, I'll give you a hint. Yeah, that was the hint. Whether it's in a manga, light novel, or original anime, isekai stories almost always transport their recently unalived main characters into some sort of fantasy setting. But way too often, that setting is generic, uninteresting, and purposefully made simple enough for the protagonists of each story to run roughshod through them without a second thought. To me, most isekai fantasy worlds feel like D&D one-shots. The world building is sparse, economic. They've got the makings of a fantasy world, your basic starting towns, job classes, and different competing races. But they lack any real detail or history, especially when compared to a narrative as thoughtful as Frieren Beyond Journey's End. Frieren is more like that D&D campaign that you play with your friends and a dedicated dungeon master for months and years, crafting lore, context, and history until you start to think of your little fantasy world as a real place with its own rules and logic. There's just something about Frieren's world that feels far more engaging when compared to the more cookie-cutter isekai settings we've all become familiar with. Unfortunately, it's those sorts of settings that have dominated the fantasy genre for a long time. The worlds of dwarves and elves and orcs haven't gone away in Japanese pop culture. They've just been stripped back, simplified, and stapled onto isekai power fantasies that rarely seem to actually care about, well, fantasy. The fact that the world of Centuria, which I promise we are getting to, is just its world, not some parallel dimension, automatically endears the manga to me personally. In only a few chapters, it already feels more real, intriguing, and dangerous. Its characters living simple lives precariously close to a murky border separating reality from grimdark legend. Isekai worlds do not feel particularly frightening or deadly. In fact, it's usually the opposite. They feel designed specifically to gas up their self-insert protagonists, and that power fantasy just doesn't hold my interest. I can never shake the feeling that these kingdoms and characters were designed with the idea of escaping our reality in mind, not designing fantastical new ones. And yes, there is a difference. Compare those shows to a series like Dungeon Meshi, where each room of the titular dungeon our heroes tread through is a chance to fully explore the ecological impacts that are created when you stuff a bunch of monsters and adventurers into the same labyrinthian environment. Dungeon Meshi's setting is most often examined through a culinary lens. What can and can't adventurers eat in a place this inhospitable? But there are also other fascinating details sprinkled throughout each level of the dungeon. One of my favorite early examples being the fact that mollusks in this world have evolved to move within and control suits of armor in place of seashells because, well, of course they have. Suits of armor are way more readily available in the sprawling golden castle found on floor 3 of the dungeon. It just makes sense that in this world they would adapt. I also love the detail that the same castle is no longer golden because adventurers have peeled the gold right off the walls for easy cash. These ideas are interesting and maybe even interconnected. It's possible the mollusk colonies were only able to establish the armor as their home because the armor was ignored by adventurers in favor of the easier to transport and more readily available gold. When the armor is introduced in the show, adventurers are only just starting to speculate whether they can make some money hauling a set or two away to the surface. But by this point, the mollusks have already staked their claim. A connection between the gold peelers and the ignored armor sets is never explicitly made by the text, but it's fun to speculate on this sort of thing, and the setting is robust enough to support that fun. What I'm trying to say is I think part of what makes Dungeon Meshi and Frieren feel so fresh is the fact that fantasy worlds like these haven't been showing up often enough in most mainstream anime, with a few rare exceptions. And it would seem like people are really hungry for these sorts of stories, for these sorts of fantasies that dare to ask questions more interesting than what if I was really strong and everyone liked me. I've certainly felt their absence, at least as far as anime is concerned. For manga, it's a bit more complicated. Here's the deal. When it comes to fantasy manga, my understanding is that there are still great traditional fantasy titles to be found, but that a lot of those are shoujo titles, which have generally not gotten as much love, attention, and support from international audiences or even their own publishers. Unlike with shonen manga, where the majority of big titles can be accessed through too cheap subscription services, most shoujo and josei manga, fantasy or otherwise, are not available digitally through official means. Some aren't even officially available in print. That's a real bummer, and also one of the main reasons I haven't read a lot of these titles. There's simply too much manga in this space that I haven't looked at, and its existence prevents me from making a statement as definitive as we are in a traditional fantasy manga drought. This sort of declaration would be ignoring a very large subsection of the manga world that I simply don't know enough about. So to solve this problem, I reached out to an expert. Colleen's Manga Rex is a YouTube channel dedicated to all things shoujo and josei. It's a great channel, and Colleen provides a very funny and informative perspective on manga that, again, often go underappreciated by Western audiences. Also, they were nice enough to respond when I reached out asking for manga recommendations in this space. What I got back from Colleen was not 1 or 2 manga recommendations, but 9, the artwork from which you've been seeing throughout this section of the video. Unfortunately, you may have to get a little, let's say, creative if you want to read all of the titles featured here due to the aforementioned access issues. But if you're savvy, you'll figure it out. So yeah, I think it's safe to say fantasy is alive and well outside of the shonen space. But that will be where we focus our attention for the rest of this video. If you'd like to know more about the topic of shoujo, I can't recommend Colleen's channel enough. If you're looking for a place to start, I would recommend watching Colleen's video on the shoujo magazine Hane to Yume, and I'll link to it in this video's description. Anyway, we've been beating around the bush for long enough. It's time to actually talk about Centuria, which has the exact opposite of an access problem. Centuria is a Shonen Jump Plus title, which means it is published as a digital-first manga in Japan and available to read for free in most of the rest of the world through the official Manga Plus app. If you want people to read your manga, getting published under this line of titles is a real win. Most Jump Plus titles are available to nearly every person on Earth with access to a smartphone. You could close this video right now, read all of Centuria for yourself, and be caught up in less than an hour. Also, while not every title is perfect, there are consistently interesting manga showing up in this lineup. The fact that Centuria is a Jump Plus title is actually one of the main reasons I decided to check it out so early on. Another was its author, Tohru Kuramori, and who he has worked with. In the world of shonen manga, there is a small but steadily growing list of mangaka with some sort of connection to Chainsaw Man creator Tatsuki Fujimoto, the levitating, movie-loving weirdo who created some of the best, strangest, and most impactful manga of the last 5 years, also somehow managed to nurture a new, exciting collection of collaborators who have gone on to create their own original series. Fujimoto's former assistants include the likes of Tatsuya Endo, Yuji Kaku, Yukinobu Tatsu, and now Tohru Kuramori, who worked with both Fujimoto and Tatsu on Goodbye Eri and Dandadan, two of my favorite manga from the last decade. Fujimoto's works are, at least to me, required reading for new manga fans. These are challenging, sometimes uncomfortable manga to read, but they are also the sorts of stories I think about at 3 in the morning. Honest, human expressions of art, love, sadness, the whole gambit. That same passion and care found in Fujimoto's manga can also be felt in the series penned by his successors, especially the work being done by Yukinobu Tatsu each week. Seriously, while you're checking out Centuria on my recommendation, do yourself a favor and join the cult of Dandadan. We serve crab cakes and milk with each meeting, it's a good time. Am I getting off topic again? Only kind of. This video has been a lot of background, probably too much, but I wanted you to know why I'm so fired up about Centuria, and there's more than one answer to that question. As a fantasy title, it has the chance to serve an audience who, until recently, were in dire need of some mainstream attention. It's being set up for success as one of the newest titles in the most easily accessible manga lineup on Earth. And it's being penned by a creator who has worked with some of the best and brightest talents out there. All Kuramori has to do is write and draw a decent title, and it has the potential to grow into one of the biggest manga on the planet, or, at the very least, as big as some of its contemporaries that I also love. Easier said than done? Oh, most certainly. But what's been released so far is really promising. When you start reading Centuria, its story may feel a little overly familiar. The manga hits a lot of the same story beats covered by pretty famous seinen manga like Berserk and Vinland Saga. The only real difference, at least structurally, is how quickly Centuria tackles these ideas, covering a manga's worth of setup in only a single extended chapter. So far, it's made for a unique reading experience. Less like starting a new manga, and more like watching a pretty impressive speedrun. Stop me if you've heard this before. A violent, loner protagonist with a dark past and a tendency to dislike people has his perspective changed when he has shown some kindness and affection in a world that is far from kind and affectionate. Through hardship and violence, he grows stronger, but his true strength is only unlocked after he chooses to fight for others instead of just for himself. This is the story of Julian, a runaway slave that chooses the worst boat ever to stow away on, a slave ship. He is quickly caught, re-enslaved, and integrated in with the rest of the ship's human cargo. It's a pretty bleak situation, but it could be even worse. The ship captain nearly kills Julian outright when he's discovered, but the captain is convinced to let the boy live when another of the ship's captives, Mira, offers to split her allocated rations with the stowaway. This one act of kindness changes Julian's worldview for the better. You see, no one has ever gone to bat for him in his entire life. Even his own mother sold him off as a child. So when Mira, a complete stranger, helps him and asks for nothing in return, he is overwhelmed by her kindness and character. Mira and the others look out for Julian and one another as the only act of rebellion they can commit: compassion. As Mira puts it, treating one another with kindness and grace allows the slaves to maintain their pride as human beings. This is Centuria's first chapter in a nutshell. A bleak world, a hopeless situation, and the people at the center of it trying to maintain their humanity through small acts of kindness. Julian is transformed by these acts. In that transformation, the opening of a closed-off heart is artfully depicted by Kuramori through his impressive character expression work. My first impression of this manga, reading it back in April, is that I really love how this guy draws faces. Julian's looks pretty harsh at first. Sharp teeth when they are visible, a thin line for a mouth when they are not. Sometimes his face is even hidden altogether by his hair or the position he's drawn in. But a gradual shift starts to happen in his close-up panels. Julian's face softens as he starts to grapple with his changing worldview. His face changes significantly as he comes to understand human compassion. First twisting in anguish as he realizes what his life has been deprived of, and then finally rounding out in an embarrassed, self-conscious smile. In the most unexpected of places, Julian finds what his life has been missing: hope and a mother's love. Mira, who is currently pregnant, decides to all but adopt Julian as well, and the two spend quiet nights together, dreaming about better days ahead. Unfortunately, these happy times can't last. Caught in a storm and off course, the ship's captain callously decides to lighten the load. He orders the execution of all 101 slaves on board. Weaponless, the slaves can only delay the inevitable, shielding Julian, a child, and Mira, who is with child, until they are the last remaining survivors. It's a largely symbolic gesture, really only staving off the inevitable. But like standing up for Julian earlier in the chapter, these nameless characters maintain their pride in the face of certain death. It may be in vain, but they protect Julian and Mira until the bitter end. The captain and his men approach to finish the job, but before Julian and Mira can be killed and tossed into the inky black ocean, the raindrops falling all around them freeze in midair, and time seems to stop altogether. Unable to move, Julian, Mira, and the ship's crew watch in horror as something emerges from the water. Tentacles creep over the gunwale, twisting and writhing until they form into this faceless monstrosity. Centuria may be a fantasy, but that fantasy is a nightmare, not a dream. This being of unimaginable power makes Julian and Mira an offer. If one is sacrificed, the other will be saved. It's a cruel choice, the life of a child or a pregnant mother. Julian is ready to die for Mira, but as he stops to give his new mother one last parting smile, she moves first. Mira sacrifices her life for Julian, stopping only to, well, give birth. It's a busy couple of pages, just go with it. With its conditions met, the Eldritch being offers Julian power. which manifests itself in his wish to prove the worth of his now slain family. He is granted the strength of 100 lives, the same lives lost on this doomed voyage. His power and speed is enhanced, so much so that he can literally break through the manga's sound effects in this panel, which I think is a really neat detail. Needless to say, Julian quickly gets his revenge, literally using the power of love, although you wouldn't know it looking at these gnarly visuals. The first chapter of Centuria ends with Julian and his new baby sister alone at sea, but equipped with the strength to face whatever comes next. Unfortunately for them, but great for us, the readers, there's a whole lot of obstacles ahead, both human and inhuman. But I'm going to end major story discussions here at Chapter 1. This extended opening act provides more than enough of an impression of the manga as a whole, and I think it's a pretty excellent way to start what has continued in the last few months to be a very promising new series. Will it save traditional fantasy manga and anime? Maybe, but it also might not even have to. There are at least a few more promising titles on the way. At this early stage in Centuria's life, I think it's good enough to simply tell you that it's definitely worth at least checking out. And no, before you ask, it's not a replacement for Berserk. Nothing ever could be. But this manga has continued to surprise and delight me chapter after chapter. The continued adventures of Julian and baby Diana are slowly deepening this manga's world, its characters, and its place among other great fantasies. For now, that's plenty. Until next time, thanks for watching.